Hey class, welcome back to week 9. This is week 9, part 2, and we will pick up where we left off because my program only allows me to shoot in 15-minute increments, so I had to begin another one so I could finish discussing this week's lesson material with you. Okay, so we were talking about race. What is it? How is it created? Remember, we talked that it is a social construct. So how do we define race in our country, America? Since it's a social construct, there must be a way to do it. And we were talking how it was through social systems, and examples of those social systems are schools, zip codes, and criminal justice. Now, while we don't have laws per se that allow us to discriminate against other people, as we did in the Jim Crow era in the South in particular, and other places before that. I mean, it's not just the South, right? I do not want to demonize the South. I live in the South, so it wasn't just the South. We all had to learn. So we don't have the ability to make laws like that, but still differences persist, right? And categories in America are even, you even check that on things like censuses and in schools, on testing, all sorts of things. And it's because places are collecting data, right? And they're wanting to analyze how groups are doing. And a lot of times this data collection is for good purposes, right? It's to make sure that social justice is being dealt out, and we aren't having laws or social policies or inequities in schools and things like that perpetuate the differences between people and inequities in the system. However, obviously, we still have a long way to go, right? So it's kind of interesting that we have these categories in America that we check off on certain things like employment and tests and schools and things like that. You know, it's interesting. I'd like to know how you feel about that. I mean, do you feel that because they now give you at least the other box, which you can always check, you know, if you maybe don't feel comfortable fitting yourself into any one of those boxes. Because as I talked in the part 1 of this video, you know, Latinos, you know, people define them sometimes on their skin color and their hair color, but then again, skin color and hair color can even match mine, right? Depending on where you're from, as a Latinx person. I have a really good friend who's an indigenous person of America. So she is actually Native American, and her ancestry goes back to the Canadian Native American, so she kind of has more of that Inuit type look, but she has, you know, dark hair, and she's got very white skin. So I had no idea she was even Native American when I met her, yet that's very much a part of her identity, you know, and she doesn't want to let go of that culture, and nor should she, you know, but it just goes again to, it shows you that it's not something that's necessarily physically identifiable, and yet many would consider that a category of race, the Native American or indigenous people. So again, it just shows you how complicated and complex these concepts are. And you know, it talks about that one drop law that had been functioning in America for some time. Again, you know, those laws are not legal anymore. You're not allowed to have those. But then again, some of those concepts continue on, like as in, you know, people calling Barack Obama the first Black president, again, when that's, you know, he's obviously mixed race. So how do you deal with that? You know, quote unquote mixed race, right? Parents of what people would have defined to socially as different races, you know. So it's very interesting. I mean, we all have genetic characteristics, right, that are passed on from parents to parents. For example, some people can roll their tongues. You see that? I can roll my tongue. Some people don't have that genetic trait, and they can't. Try as they may, they cannot roll their tongues. Other people have detached or undetached earlobes, okay? Mine are undetached. Some of my children are detached, and I'm their mother, right? And some people that would be considered, you know, historically Black people also, you know, totally different. Maybe they can roll their tongues, maybe they can't. Maybe they have detached earlobes, maybe they don't. Maybe they have you know, they have all different types of hair. So, you know, there would be no difference between my genetic code and somebody who would be traditionally considered a Black person as much as me and some just complete stranger off the street. So, you know, just as much difference between us, and who knows what that race would have been, right? So again, it goes to the fact that it's not a genetic thing, it's not a skin color thing, it's not a hair color thing, it's not an eye color thing. It's a psychological thing. It's a socially constructed concept and a psychologically constructed concept. So how do we dismantle these artificial boundaries, maintaining current power structures? Because these laws and these social policies that have been in place in our country for decades and even centuries have instantiated certain people in positions of power. And that wealth has been able to continue generation after generation. For example, remember the Amy Hunter video where she analyzed about the zip codes where people live, and then the schools that are in those certain zip codes, and then criminal justice at work in certain neighborhoods where, maybe they're really safe neighborhoods, maybe they're not safe, maybe there's a big police presence, maybe there's not, maybe the police harass people, maybe they don't, but all of those things go into where you can even live in America, and where you can live depends on in large part, how much money you make, and how much money you make depends a lot on your education level, right? How much education often will determine, how much education a person has will often determine how much a person makes. So yay for you that you're all in school, right? And you're bettering yourselves, you're getting your educations, and you're increasing your chances for a higher paying job. And that higher paying job will lead to a safer neighborhood with better schools. And your children will then be raised, if you have children, going to schools that provide better education. And then that better education will lead to better jobs, which leads to more money, which leads to being able to buy a house in a more expensive neighborhood, which then will lead to better schools. And the whole system just repeats and repeats and repeats. You see how those things just feed one into the other, into the other, into the other. And it just begets itself, one generation after another. So how do we dismantle these boundaries that instantiate current power structures and current systems of privilege? Well, Amy Hunter talked about fictive kinship as being a solution, where we all feel for each other. We all embrace each other's problems. We all love each other and want to treat each other as we would want to be treated. And that goes back to the golden rule, which we've talked about, in our world for millennia, right? If we could all just treat each other the way we would want to be treated ourselves, that would give us a big picture in how somebody else feels. We'd be able to take a walk in their shoes and see what their lives are like and feel what they feel. And that actually brings me to a very interesting study that was done in the 1960s. And again, it comes down to a teacher wanting to educate the students in her classroom, it's elementary school, about race and race relations in the United States and laws that had been prohibiting people from having equal access to privilege in the United States. So it happened actually the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in 1968. And her students asked why he'd been shot. So she had been teaching them about Native Americans, and she had been putting together a lesson about the Sioux Indians, or the Sioux Native American population, and she was using a quote that said, "Oh, Great Spirit, keep me from ever judging a man until I have walked in his moccasins." So wanting to teach her about why somebody would assassinate Martin Luther King Jr., and for advocating for equity and civil rights for all people in America, and why would he need to do this, and why would that make people so angry? Well, she tried a little exercise with her class where she said, okay, I'm going to teach you why some of these things are the way they are in our country, why people have privilege and others don't, and why people will perceive people certain ways and people don't. So she said, okay, everybody, and the whole classroom was actually a white skin-colored population. I believe the classroom was in Iowa, so very middle America. And she said, all right, all brown-eyed kids go on one side of the classroom, all blue-eyed kids go on the other side. Now, here is the exercise. Right now, all the brown-eyed children will be considered the superior children in this classroom. They're superior because they have more melanin, and more melanin is linked to greater intelligence. So they are smarter, and because they're smarter and superior, they're superior, and because they're superior, they will have more privileges, and the blue-eyed children will not. And then she made very large blue-eyed collars that she put around the blue-eyed children so that they would be immediately recognized by the other children in the classroom that they are the blue-eyed ones. Now, the blue-eyed ones had to sit in the back of the classroom, and the brown-eyed children were allowed to sit up front in the classroom. And the brown-eyed children got extra helpings at lunch, and they got extra recess time, and they got to go onto the new jungle gym before anybody else did, and they got to use certain water fountains while the blue-eyed children had to use other water fountains, and they got in trouble, the blue-eyed children, for ever trying to use the brown-eyed children's water fountain. And interestingly, do you know what happened? It's pretty bizarre, but test scores actually even started to be affected by this. And maybe that's because the blue-eyed children had to sit in the back and the brown-eyed ones sat up front. Sometimes there's something about engagement, that happens the closer you are in a classroom. And maybe it was because they were starting to buy into the idea that they were inferior and the other children were superior. And so sometimes you think, well, what can I do? This is the situation I have. So their test scores, the blue-eyed children's test scores started going down. They started feeling, having lower self-esteem. And then the next week, guess what? Or I'm not sure what time frame maybe it was a couple weeks later, she switched it and she said, okay, now all blue-eyed children are superior and all brown-eyed are inferior. And she reversed all the privileges where the blue-eyed got to sit up front and the brown-eyed got to sit in the back. And they did that again for another several weeks. And, the blue-eyed got the privileges then and the brown-eyed didn't. And the test score difference persisted, but it wasn't as drastic as the first implementation of the exercise. And maybe that was because they were all starting to catch on that this didn't have to do with anything about them. It was just an external label put on them by the system. And then she stopped the exercise. And of course, she told them, none of this has to do with anything. More melanin does not equate to superior intelligence or inferior intelligence. This was just trying to recreate the social system in America that was telling people the very same thing for decades, for centuries, that people with certain melanin, that is the pigmentation that makes your skin lighter or darker, your hair lighter or darker, your eye color lighter or darker, that would actually differentiate people on advantage and privilege level and in legal systems, and even people thinking that the ones with less melanin were superior in intelligence and the ones with more inferior. So of course we know these are all social constructs, and they are not in any way valid scientifically or otherwise. And the class actually learned this through living it. And they were all set straight, and they analyzed it, they discussed it, they talked about how they felt when they were, in the position of privilege or in the position of disadvantage. And they discussed, how it made them feel towards each other and even inwardly with themselves. All right, so very interesting experiment. So I'm going to talk about now some of the readings that we're going to do this week. So one in particular, I'm having you read the Racial Segregation in the United States Wikipedia article. Now, sometimes Wikipedia gets a bad rap because people don't think it's scholarly. However, I think it's a great overview to a topic, and that's why I'm having you read it. So you get kind of a historical perspective of how races have been segregated in the United States over time. Now, I want you to kind of look at the outline so you have a good idea of where the article is going and how race and segregation have evolved over time, and then maybe kind of skim the whole article, but then focus really on only two sections because it's a very long article. So you really have to just pick out two that interest you the most and read them in detail so that you may be able to maybe use them on your essay next week, where we're talking about what race is and how we define it in America, what social systems go into that, and what laws and what social policies and things like that, and how we can change these things. And the way we can change them is by finding out how. The way we can find them is by finding out how they're established. And when we know how they're established, that's how we can dismantle them. All right, so things that we're going to be reading this week. I talked about the myth of race. We're going to go into week 9 right here. And we have readings The Myth of Race, White Poverty by Bell Hooks, which talks about, how even certain white groups are also privileged or not, racial segregation. And we're going to do a